I saw her, without being seen, in the middle of that party where I should never have been. The environment was too elegant for me, people were too rich, conversations that seemed to come from some movie far from my reality. But I was there, hiding in her boss's house. Not willingly, but because I knew, from the moment I felt her coldness over the last few weeks, that something was deeply wrong. My mind was spinning, every second in that place seemed to suffocate my chest. I tried to find an explanation, whatever it was. But, as I watched her, laughing, comfortable, with her arms loose around that man, the same man who was supposed to be her superior at work, the only thing that was left in me it was certainty. What I had imagined, what I feared more than anything else, was happening right in front of me. They moved as if they owned that space, as if each other's presence was natural, routine. Something between them had existed for much longer than I could have imagined. The smile she reserved for him. That look I hadn't seen at home for months, the way her fingers intertwined in an intimate and familiar gesture. My heart was racing. My mind was screaming at me to get out of there, but something was holding me back. Something I needed to confirm, something I needed to see with my own eyes, as if pain were the price for the truth. They walked away, towards a more reserved corridor, away from the curious eyes of the party. I followed, still unnoticed, with my fists clenched, my body rigid. My every step seemed to echo louder inside my head. Finally, they stopped in front of a door. I was close enough to hear her whisper, a soft voice that, in that moment, sounded like a knife piercing my chest. "No one will know," she said. "He has no idea. He trusts me." I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. The trust one had placed in her, all the years of marriage, the promises of love, of fidelity. Now, everything was nothing more than a blatant lie. I was blind. And they, there, together, laughing at me. How had I not seen this before? I couldn't take it anymore. My legs were shaking, but I moved closer. When she saw me, her face lost all color. Her eyes, which were once full of charm and desire, were now full of fear and surprise. "It's over," I said, without hesitation. "Everything between us is over." The silence that followed was deafening. The party continued in the background, distant laughter, conversations that seemed irrelevant given the chaos that was forming inside me. She tried to say something, but I didn't allow it. There was nothing more to be said. There were no excuses, no justifications. Just the cruel, naked, cold truth. But as I turned to leave, something inside me still burned. One last detail, a piece that didn't fit. Why here, in his house? Why now, after so many years? She ran after me, her eyes pleading for something I could no longer offer, forgiveness. And it was at that moment that I realized. This wasn't just a betrayal of desire. There was more. There was something bigger, hidden between the lines of that betrayal. A reason that had not yet been revealed. Something she didn't want me to know. I stopped, without turning to face her again. "What are you hiding from me?" I asked, my voice low, controlled, but filled with contained fury. "This isn't just about the two of us, is it?" Her silence was the confirmation I feared. The weight of that betrayal was deeper than I could imagine. And in that instant, I knew there was still a lot I didn't know. Something big was coming, something that would change everything, forever. And the truth, this dark and painful truth, was about to be revealed. Jonathan has always been a man of routines. Born and raised in a city full of traditions and firm values, he believed his life would follow the same predictable course. Waking up early, having breakfast with his wife, going to work and, at the end of the day, returning home, where he and Emily shared a simple meal. Their years of marriage had been calm, comfortable. The flame of romance, although not as intense as in the beginning, still existed there, in small gestures of care and silent glances. Jonathan was never the type to question his wife's love. She always seemed to be everything he needed. And maybe that's why he never allowed himself to doubt. Emily, on the other hand, carried a restless energy. Her spirit has always been free, but, with Jonathan, she learned to adapt. Not that she felt trapped, far from it. At first, she genuinely loved him. He was the safe haven in a life full of emotional storms, the stable man who always pulled her back to earth when she got lost in her daydreams. Jonathan had something she valued, constancy. But, over the years, constancy turned into routine, and routine into predictability. Emily had ambitions. She wanted more from life, more than the repetitive days at Jonathan's side could offer. After getting a job at a large local company, her professional life began to take off. The demands of work took her away from home, and she found herself increasingly immersed in a new world, full of challenges and expectations, different from the predictable security she shared with her husband. Jonathan didn't question the changes in Emily, but he felt them deeply. She spent more time outside, arriving home late, claiming to be tired. At first, he believed it was just the demanding work, and he felt proud of his wife's success. But, little by little, something in her attitude changed. Conversations at the dinner table became shorter, the looks between them more distant. Jonathan tried to convince himself that this was part of any couple's life, that there was nothing wrong, just the natural wear and tear of the years. But something inside him, a restlessness he couldn't name, began to form. He remembered how Emily used to laugh easily, how her eyes lit up when she talked about projects at work, or how excited she was about little adventures they planned on the weekends. Now, however, she seemed constantly distracted, always looking at her cell phone or mentioning something about meetings with her boss, who seemed to be an increasingly present figure in her conversations. Jonathan didn't know much about this man except for his name, Thomas. A name that he began to hear with a frequency that bothered him, but that he never dared to openly question. Emily's boss, Thomas, was a shrewd and successful businessman known for his charisma and ambition. He wasn't married, and this became a detail that Jonathan, in his moments of reverie, began to notice more than he would have liked. Every time Emily talked about a new project, a new goal at work, Thomas's name came up, and with it, the silent discomfort in Jonathan's chest grew. He didn't know if it was jealousy, insecurity, or just a vague intuition, but he felt like something was changing irreversibly. Emily, on the other hand, began to feel torn. Professional success, which previously seemed so distant, was now within reach. Thomas had become more than just a boss, he was her mentor, the man who helped her grow in her career, who saw something in her that Jonathan, in his simplicity, would never see. The admiration Emily felt for him grew every day, mixing with something more, something she didn't allow herself to name. Overtime at the office has become more frequent. Jonathan, faithful to his routine, waited at home, silent, pretending to himself that everything was fine. He immersed himself in work, in the little hobbies that always distracted him, but he never asked again about the long nights or the messages she received in the middle of the night, always accompanied by a quick and evasive excuse. Until a moment came when Jonathan began to doubt his own perception. Maybe he was being paranoid, maybe it was all just a phase. Emily had never given him any reason to be suspicious. But the emptiness she left beside him in bed, the absence of sweet words and affection, began to slowly erode his certainty. He tried to convince himself that she still loved him, but at some point, doubt started to become stronger than trust. And it was in this heavy, silent atmosphere that their relationship began to fall apart. Jonathan knew deep down that something was wrong. But what he still didn't know, or didn't want to admit, was that things would never go back to the way they were before. Emily felt suffocated, torn between the loyalty she still felt for Jonathan and her growing admiration for Thomas. She tried to ignore the fact that perhaps she was distancing herself too much, that her choices were creating an abyss between her and the man who had once been her refuge. Jonathan, without knowing it, was on the verge of discovering that the safe and predictable world he had built alongside Emily was about to fall apart. But at that moment, he still believed that love was strong enough to overcome any obstacle. The question he didn't allow himself to ask was, how long could this love last before being completely destroyed? The days passed slowly, but the discomfort grew with each hour. Jonathan woke up every morning with the same feeling, as if something was slipping from his grasp, something he couldn't define. Emily was more distant than ever. The nights she spent out, citing work commitments, were no longer an exception, but a rule. He tried not to think too much, busy himself with work, with small household tasks, but, at the end of each day, her absence was what really filled the house. On one of those days, something finally broke inside him. Jonathan silently took her cell phone while she was in the shower. He had never done this before. He was not the type of man who allowed himself to be carried away by paranoia. He believed that the foundation of any relationship was trust, and he had always trusted Emily. But now, something inside him screamed. He needed answers, or at least some proof that everything he felt was a figment of his imagination. Emily's phone didn't have complicated passwords. The trust she placed in Jonathan was, until then, unshakable. He opened the messages, the notifications accumulated. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But then, something made him stop. A message that, at first, seemed harmless, but which bothered him due to its content. It was from Thomas. Jonathan hesitated, but clicked. The words exchanged between them weren't overtly compromising, but the tone, the intimacy in the answers, the smiles, the details that Emily never shared with him, everything there seemed wrong. They talked about things Jonathan didn't even know were part of Emily's life, from meetings outside of the office to late-night conversations that were never mentioned. Their relationship, no matter how much they tried to disguise it, was not just professional. Jonathan's stomach dropped. He closed his cell phone, feeling out of breath. Why had she never mentioned these outlets? Why did these conversations sound so intimate? He was about to confront her, but decided against it. Something inside him said he needed to wait, he needed more certainty. Just dubious words and digital smiles weren't enough. He needed to see, needed to confront reality. And so, he began to watch Emily's steps more closely, with a care he would never have imagined needing to take. The following week, she mentioned a work event. An important meeting, she said, looking away when she mentioned that Thomas would be there. The discomfort in her tone was enough for Jonathan to realize there was something more behind their encounter. He just nodded, without question, but his mind was already made up. That night, he would go after her. He needed to know the truth, even if it cost him what little peace he had left in his life. Night arrived, and Jonathan drove to the location of the meeting, an event that would take place at Emily's boss's house. He stopped the car at a safe distance and waited. Time seemed to drag by, and anxiety gnawed at every bit of his sanity. He wondered if he was exaggerating, if this was all a big mess created in his head. But then, he saw Emily's car park, and along with her, he saw Thomas. They left together, laughing, talking, without any worries. She didn't look like the woman Jonathan knew, not there, not like that. There was something between the two that was impossible to ignore. Jonathan followed them with his gaze as they entered the house. He waited for a while, trying to gather his courage, trying to decide if he was ready to face what he knew was coming. But with each passing minute, the certainty within him grew. Something was happening. Something he could no longer ignore. With his heart racing and cold sweat running down his back, Jonathan got out of the car. He entered the house, going unnoticed among the people who had already arrived. The place was big, luxurious, full of people he didn't know. Everyone was too distracted to notice his presence, which was exactly what he needed. He headed toward the distant sound of laughter, his step steady but his heart heavy. He found Emily in one of the halls, standing next to Thomas. The intimacy between the two was impossible to hide. She smiled at him in a way she no longer smiled at Jonathan, and her eyes sparkled in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. Jonathan froze for a second. Every doubt, every hesitation, evaporated in that moment. He continued to watch them, the minimum distance now between him and the truth. They talked, laughed, and she touched Thomas's arm in a way that made Jonathan's stomach turn. She was comfortable, much more than she should have been. Then he saw it. The subtle touch, the looks exchanged, as if nothing else existed around. And finally, the kiss. It wasn't long, it wasn't exaggerated, but it was enough. Jonathan felt the world fall apart. The scene before him could not be ignored, there was no longer any way to pretend that everything was fine. Every piece of trust he had in Emily, every memory built over the years, all shattered in an instant. She finally saw him, and her smile disappeared in the same second. Shock washed over his face. But for Jonathan, it was already too late. The time for explanations, for excuses, was over. He knew this was the truth he feared to find. But there was still something left. Something he still didn't fully understand. Jonathan couldn't process what he had just seen. Emily, his wife, the woman he had shared a lifetime with, was kissing another man, and not just any man, her boss, Thomas. Everything inside him seemed to fall apart at once. His mind struggled to put the pieces together, but his body had already decided for him, it was time to face the truth, no matter how painful it was. She saw him. His face fell into surprise, and confusion quickly took over his expression. Emily's eyes searched for an explanation, a justification for what she knew was happening. But Jonathan didn't want explanations. The weight of betrayal was too great, and the pain was unbearable. He advanced slowly, as if each step was a sentence. The words stuck in his throat formed a knot he didn't know how to untie. Emily, for her part, didn't move. She was frozen, words escaping her lips as her eyes begged for an opportunity to explain the unexplainable. "Jonathan," she began, her voice trembling, almost inaudible. He interrupted her with a sharp gesture of his hand. There was no more room for excuses, for empty explanations. He had seen with his own eyes what she had done, and anything she said now would only make him angrier. "Don't talk," he said, his voice low, but filled with a hatred he never imagined he would feel for someone he loved. "There's nothing more to say." Emily tried to take a step toward him, but Jonathan stepped back, keeping his distance. The coldness in his gaze was as cutting as the silence that followed. She knew she had destroyed everything, but still, something inside her prevented her from letting it all end there. She needed to talk, needed to try. "It's not what you think," she began again, her voice trailing off. Jonathan laughed bitterly, a short, pained laugh. "Isn't that what I think?" he repeated, incredulously. "I just saw you kissing this man, your boss, and you still have the courage to say that it's not what I think." Thomas, until then silent, tried to intervene. But Jonathan didn't give him the opportunity. "Stay out of this," he snapped, his eyes fixed on Emily. "This is between me and her." Thomas raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, realizing this was not the time to argue. Emily, in turn, tried once again to get closer, but the expression on Jonathan's face paralyzed her. "I trusted you, Emily," he said, his voice now lower, but still filled with anger. "I trusted you all these years, and what did you do with it? You threw it all away. Our whole life, our whole marriage, for this." Emily shook her head, tears already forming in her eyes. She tried to find an explanation, something that could justify what she had done, but nothing seemed adequate. She knew there was no excuse for what happened, but the thought of losing Jonathan forever was unbearable. I made a mistake," he finally admitted. "I don't know how it happened, Jonathan. I never wanted to hurt you." Her words only made things worse. Jonathan felt as if every word was a direct blow to his heart. He loved her, he couldn't deny that. But love, at that moment, was an open wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "A mistake?" he repeated, incredulously. "One mistake is forgetting to lock the door. What you did wasn't a mistake, Emily." It was a choice. You chose to betray our trust, our marriage, everything we have built. Silence fell between them again, heavy, suffocating. Emily knew he was right. She had made a choice, and now she needed to face the consequences of it. But the truth she hid was even more cruel, more destructive. There was something she didn't have the courage to reveal, something that could devastate Jonathan in ways he hadn't yet imagined. Jonathan didn't want to hear anything anymore. He took a step back, feeling the ground seem to move beneath his feet. His head was spinning, emotions were fighting inside him in a whirlwind that he couldn't control. He needed to get out of there, he needed to breathe, but before turning to leave, he looked at her one last time. "It's over, Emily," he said, his voice firm. "There is nothing left between us." Emily froze. She knew she was losing everything, but there was still something she needed to confess. Something that could change the entire dynamic of that conversation, but at the same time could destroy what was left of Jonathan. "Jonathan, wait," she said, her voice now full of despair. But he was already walking towards the door, determined to leave everything behind. "Wait!" she shouted, now her voice was choked. Jonathan stopped. He didn't want to look back, he didn't want to prolong the suffering any longer, but something in Emily's voice made him hesitate. He took a deep breath before turning around again. There she was, standing still, her face covered in tears, her eyes desperate. Something in her gaze made him feel like there was more, something he didn't know. "What is it now?" he asked tiredly, pain brimming from every word. "Wasn't that enough?" Emily hesitated. She knew that if she revealed what she was about to say, there would be no turning back. But at the same time, she knew she couldn't let Jonathan leave without knowing the whole truth. "It wasn't just," she began, her voice breaking again. "It wasn't just that, Jonathan." He frowned, not understanding. "What are you saying?" Emily looked at Thomas, who also looked apprehensive. The silence between the three was heavy, as if time had stopped for a moment. Jonathan expected it, but he already knew that anything that came next would only make the situation worse. "The truth is," she hesitated once again, struggling to find the words. I wasn't promoted based on merit." Jonathan was silent, trying to understand where this would lead him. He already knew that Thomas had a big influence on Emily's career, but he hadn't thought much about it. Until now. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his patience running out quickly. Emily took a deep breath, knowing the next step would change everything. "My promotion was because of him." She looked at Thomas with a mixture of shame and regret. "He gave me the promotion because we had been together for months." The statement fell like a bomb. Jonathan felt the world collapse once again, only this time with even greater intensity. It wasn't just an emotional betrayal. Emily had gotten involved with Thomas to move up her career. She had traded her marriage, their love, for a promotion. Jonathan stared at Thomas, now with eyes full of hatred. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. All the trust he had in Emily, everything he believed about her, had been destroyed in seconds. Emily continued to speak, although her voice was barely audible. "I got carried away, Jonathan. At first, I just wanted to grow at work, and he helped me. But things got out of control. And when I realized, it was already too late." Jonathan could no longer hear. The betrayal had become something much bigger than he could bear. Not only had she betrayed him physically, but she had used it to get ahead, destroying any sense of respect or dignity he had for her. He felt his legs weaken, but he remained standing. Jonathan knew that revelation was the end of everything. What he didn't yet know was how it would change him forever. Jonathan stood still, the silence between him and Emily becoming almost palpable. The weight of the revelation hit him with a force he didn't know how to process. Every piece of his life with her now felt like a disassembled puzzle, and he felt lost among all the fragments. The betrayal, Emily's involvement with Thomas, the promotion bought by destroying what they built together, all of this formed an abyss impossible to cross. Emily remained standing, curled up in pain and regret. I knew there was no way to fix what was broken. But still, she held on to the hope that, somehow, Jonathan might understand. That, even with everything falling apart, he could see the human weakness that led her to make those decisions. That there was still room for forgiveness. Jonathan, her voice was soft, hesitant. I know you hate me now. I know what I did is unforgivable. But I need you to know, it was never about the promotion. It was never about the work. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep pain she could barely bear. He didn't say anything, and his silence encouraged her to continue, even though she knew each word was a knife swinging deeper into the wound she herself had caused. I lost myself, she continued, now with tears streaming down her face. The routine, the life we led. I started to feel like nothing had any meaning anymore. Work was the only thing that made me feel alive, and Thomas, he made me feel seen again. I know this doesn't justify anything. I know I betrayed you in every way possible, but I wanted you to understand why I let myself get carried away. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice hoarse and distant. To understand? Do you think what you did can be understood? He shook his head slowly in disbelief. You destroyed everything, Emily. Our trust, our marriage, you threw away the one thing I thought would be forever. His words were harsh, but Emily knew she deserved every one of them. She didn't try to defend herself. She knew that what she did was unjustified, but she also couldn't bear the idea of losing Jonathan without at least trying to make him understand what led her to that point. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Jonathan closed his eyes, trying to contain the anger and sadness that boiled over inside him. Her apology, although sincere, seemed empty given the scale of the betrayal. It was as if nothing she said could reach the depth of the pain he was feeling. He walked to the window, staring into the darkness outside. Jonathan's mind ran in circles, trying to make sense of it all, but nothing made sense. How could Emily do that to him? How could she trade everything they had for something so empty, so small? But as questions flooded his mind, he began to realize something. Something that bothered him deeply. Emily was begging for forgiveness, for understanding, but there was a part of Jonathan that couldn't shake the idea that somehow he was guilty too. Not because of the betrayal, but because he had distanced himself so much that she didn't even feel able to talk to him about what was missing. Jonathan was always the man who offered security, stability. But perhaps, in his quest to keep his life organized and stable, he has neglected Emily's emotional needs. He turned to her, the expression on his face softening for a brief moment. I made a mistake too, didn't I? He said, more to himself than to her. I was absent. I was so focused on keeping things the way they were that I didn't realize you were feeling alone. Emily sniffled, trying to hold back the tears. She didn't want Jonathan to feel guilty. Not after everything she had done. No, Jonathan. Don't do that. I was the only one to blame. You have always been good to me. I'm the one. I'm the one who let myself go. But he shook his head, cutting her off. It's not just you, Emily. A marriage does not fall apart because of any one person. I noticed the changes, but I didn't want to see them. I didn't want to believe something was wrong. And now we are here. Emily looked at him, her eyes full of regret. She knew he was right, but she also knew that, as much as they had both failed, she had betrayed his heart in a way that was difficult to overcome. They could try to forgive each other, try to understand what led each to that point, but the scar of betrayal would always be a painful reminder of what was lost. Jonathan approached her, stopping just inches away. He looked deep into her eyes, searching for something, anything that could spark a spark of hope. But all he saw was regret. And while that was genuine, it wasn't enough. What do we do now? He asked, his voice filled with deep sadness. Emily had no answer. She didn't know what could be done. They were at a point of no return, where the past held them back and the future was uncertain. What was once a life together now seemed like a series of disjointed pieces, and reconciliation seemed further away than ever. "I don't know," she admitted. "I wish I could go back, if I never did any of this." Jonathan nodded, understanding what she meant. He also wished he could erase everything. "But I knew that was impossible. All that was left now was to decide whether they would live with the burden of the past or go their separate ways." The moral dilemma that presented itself to Jonathan was devastating. On the one hand, he knew he could forgive her, that he could try to rebuild what was destroyed. But on the other hand, he knew he might never be able to trust Emily again. And living with this constant doubt, with this shadow of betrayal always present, seemed unbearable. He took a step back, trying to find clarity amidst the chaos his life had become. Emily watched him, waiting for some answer, some sign that there was still a chance. But deep down, she also knew that their fates were on the brink. Jonathan took a deep breath, as if he was about to make the most difficult decision of his life. The silence that hung between Jonathan and Emily was dense, almost suffocating. He remained still, his eyes fixed on her, as he tried to process the avalanche of emotions that hit him. Every fiber of his being wanted to believe that there was still a chance, that everything could be fixed somehow, but the brutal reality of betrayal was a weight he knew he couldn't carry forever. As much as he tried to rationalize it, the love he felt for Emily was now a burden that brought more pain than comfort. Emily, on the other hand, remained silent, absorbing Jonathan's blank stare. She knew there were no more words, no more excuses that could repair what she had destroyed. Her betrayal had not just been physical, but emotional, and the revelation that her rise at work was linked to her affair with Thomas had been the final blow. She had destroyed Jonathan's trust and, with it, the future they had planned together. Regret consumed every part of his being, but the damage was done. Jonathan finally broke the silence. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice so low that Emily almost didn't hear it. She lifted her head, her eyes already swollen from crying. "I tried," he continued, the words coming out with difficulty. "I tried to understand, I tried to forgive. But every time I look at you, I only see the lie. I only see what you hid from me. And it destroys me a little more every day." Emily swallowed hard, feeling the pain in Jonathan's voice like a knife. She knew she was losing the only person who truly mattered, but it was too late. There was nothing else to do. "I love you, Jonathan. I always loved it." Her voice broke at the end of the sentence. But she knew it wasn't enough. The love she said she felt for him could not erase what she had done. Jonathan shook his head slowly. "I loved you too, Emily. But love is not enough when trust is gone. And ours is gone. You didn't just destroy our marriage, you destroyed our history." Emily burst into tears, but Jonathan didn't come any closer. Something inside him broke once and for all. The man who one day would have done everything to protect and care for her was no longer there. He had become a shadow, someone unrecognizable to himself, but also someone who now understood the need to move on, even if it meant cutting ties that once seemed unbreakable. "I'm leaving home tomorrow," Jonathan said, his voice determined. "I need to move on, away from all this. I can't live this lie anymore." Emily tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. She knew she had lost. And, in a way, I knew I deserved it. The next day, Jonathan packed his things in silence. The house that had once been a home now felt cold, empty. He looked around, seeing the traces of a life he had so carefully built, but which was now nothing more than a collection of bitter memories. Emily was sitting in the living room, watching silently, without the strength to try to convince him to stay. She knew there was nothing more to say. As he walked out the door, Jonathan felt the fresh air outside like a punch to the chest. He took a deep breath, as if inhaling a new life, one that, despite the pain, would take him away from everything that had been destroyed. It was the beginning of something different, something that he still couldn't define, but that freed him from the emotional prison in which he found himself. Emily remained in the room, alone, staring into space. That silence became his only companion in the days that followed. She tried to find a way to deal with the crushing guilt, but Jonathan's absence was a constant reminder of what she had lost forever. As for Thomas, he also felt the impact of what had happened. The relationship between him and Emily did not survive the chaos that came after the revelation. What they had was based on lies and selfish ambitions, and without the facade of power and control, everything fell apart. He, who always thought he was in control, realized too late that he had destroyed not only someone else's marriage, but also his own career and reputation. News of the case spread, and Thomas saw his prestigious position crumble. He was left alone, wrapped up in the consequences of his own choices. Jonathan, in turn, found a way forward. The pain of betrayal did not disappear immediately, but little by little he learned to live with it, to let go of the past and look to the future. He rebuilt himself, not in the same way as before, but with a strength that came from the experience of having lost everything and still standing. And so, each one followed their path, carrying the weight of their choices. Jonathan, with the strength of someone who has survived the worst, Emily, with the regret of someone who destroyed what they loved most, and Thomas, with the certainty that power and ambition would never be enough to fill the void he created. The end did not bring redemption, but it did bring clarity. And for Jonathan, that was enough. If you liked this story, leave your comment below. We want to know your opinion about the impactful outcome. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.